The costumes, the hair. There's only one ABBA. And after decades of going their own way, the Swedish supergroup is back.
Before we begin, a word on what this is. You may have seen videos online claiming Benny Andersson has finally confirmed secret confessions about ABBA, quotes about brokenness, guilt, and hidden pain that sound dramatic and revealing. Most of that material is fabricated. It is generated content dressed up as journalism, built to look emotional rather than to be true. This script takes a different approach. Every fact here is drawn from documented history, Andersson's own biography, verified interviews, and the official record of ABBA's history. It won't invent tearful confessions. It doesn't need to. The real story of Benny Andersson told straight is dramatic enough on its own. Long before Dancing Queen filled dance floors around the world, Benny Andersson was a small boy in Vasastan, a district of Stockholm, growing up in a home shaped by music that had nothing to do with pop charts. He was born on December 16, 1946, to a civil engineer father, GSTA, and his wife Layla. But it was his grandfather, Ephraim, and his father who gave him his first real education in sound. Both played the accordion, and Sweden's folk tradition ran through the household like a second language. At 6 years old, Benny got his own accordion. It wasn't a symbolic gift for a future pop icon. It was simply how music was passed down in his family, the way it had been passed to his father before him. Through the accordion, he absorbed the melancholic minor key character of Swedish folk and traditional music, the same character listeners would later hear buried inside even ABBA's brightest, most danceable songs. That contrast, cheerful surface over a darker undercurrent, wasn't an accident or a marketing formula. It was simply the sound Benny had grown up inside of, long before he ever touched a synthesizer or stepped into a recording studio. By his teenage years, he had moved from folk accordion into the pop world, eventually landing as a keyboardist in the Hep Stars, one of the biggest pop groups in Sweden during the 1960s. It was a period of real, unglamorous work, touring, recording, performing, the kind of grinding apprenticeship that shapes a musician's instincts long before fame arrives. Benny wasn't chasing a persona. He was learning his instrument, learning arrangement, learning what made a melody stick in someone's head for decades. The story of ABBA cannot be told without the story of a friendship that began in June 1966, when Benny Andersson met Björn Ulvaeus for the first time. Björn was a member of the Hootenanny Singers, a hugely popular Swedish folk group, while Benny was still playing keyboards with the Hep Stars. Site index equals 41. Just a few weeks after meeting, the two wrote their first song together, Seat, an early sign of a creative chemistry that would eventually reshape global pop music. Site index W17.1. By the end of the 1960s, Björn and Benny had established themselves as a regular songwriting partnership, with Benny having left the Hep Stars and the Hootenanny Singers existing only as a studio project by that point. Site index W41. Their first real hits as a songwriting duo came in the spring of 1969, with Ljuva Sextetal becoming a hit for singer Britta Borg, and Spelleman a hit for the Hep Stars. Site. These early credits may not be widely remembered today, but they were the proving ground. Benny and Björn were learning how to write songs for other people's voices, sharpening the exact skill that would later define ABBA's sound: melodies, precise and universal enough that anyone could sing them, yet emotionally specific enough to feel personal. What made the partnership work wasn't just talent, it was a natural division of labor. Benny built the musical architecture, the chord changes, the harmonic tension, the arrangement choices that gave a song its emotional temperature. Björn shaped the lyrics and narrative framing. Neither role was more important than the other, but together, they created something neither could have built alone. This division would remain essentially unchanged for the rest of their working lives, through ABBA and long after it, into decades of musical theater collaboration. Site index W18.1. In the spring of 1969, Björn and Benny met the two women who would become both their fiancées and the other half of ABBA. Site. Agnetha Flodskog had already built a career as a successful solo singer in Sweden since 1967. Annie Frid Lingstad, known to the world as Frida, had an even more unusual origin story. Frida was born in 1945 in a small village inside the Arctic Circle in Norway, the daughter of a Norwegian woman and a German soldier during the Second World War occupation. Because of the social stigma attached to relationships between Norwegian women and German soldiers at the time, Frida was raised largely by her maternal grandmother, eventually settling with her in Sweden. Frida had already built her own singing career in Swedish jazz-oriented cabaret circuits before meeting Benny. When the four of them, Benny, Bjorn, Agnetha, and Frida, began crossing paths professionally and personally in 1969, none of them were thinking about forming a supergroup, cite Index.U17.1. At first, they simply began contributing to one another's individual and duo recording projects, backing vocals, instrumental work, production help. Cite Index.U17.1. It wasn't until 1970 that the appeal of their four voices combined gave them the idea of forming a cabaret act, initially performing under the name Festfolk. Cite Index equals 16.1. A pivotal informal moment came during a 1970 holiday. The four of them took together in Cyprus, where for the first time they sang together as a quartet, closing out the trip with an impromptu performance for soldiers stationed on the island. It was an unplanned rehearsal for a partnership that would soon become one of the most successful musical acts in history, though at the time, it was simply four friends singing together on a beach. By the early 1970s, the personal and professional lives of these four people had become fully entwined. Cite Index.U17.1. Agnetha and Bjorn were married in July 1971. Benny and Frida did not marry until October 1978. Cite. But their relationship had begun years earlier, growing out of the same late-night studio sessions and shared creative work that had brought all four of them together. The formal group known as ABBA was assembled in Stockholm in 1972, taking its name from the first initials of the four members. According to ABBA's own official history, the name was originally written out in full as Bjorn, Benny, Agnetha, Frida, before being simplified and stylized into the now famous four-letter mark, complete with its distinctive mirrored B, a design detail that emerged almost by accident. After a photographer noticed Benny had reversed his letter during a photo shoot, and the group decided they liked the effect enough to keep it. Their early attempts at wider success were modest, and in some cases, outright failures. One of their first joint projects was contributing music to a Swedish film that never found an audience, but steady, unglamorous work, singles, festival submissions, production work for each other built the foundation for what came next. Cite Index equals 18.1. In 1974, ABBA won the Eurovision Song Contest for Sweden with Waterloo, a victory that would later be voted the best song in the competition's 50-year history. Cite. It was the moment the group shifted from a well-regarded Scandinavian act into a genuine global phenomenon. Over the next 8 years, Benny and Bjorn wrote and produced 8 studio albums together, while Agnetha and Frida gave the songs their unmistakable vocal identity. What set ABBA apart from other pop acts of the era wasn't just catchy songwriting, it was Benny's appetite for studio innovation. He embraced multi-track recording and early synthesizer technology at a time when many contemporaries were still working with simpler arrangements, layering instrumentation and vocal harmonies into something closer to cinematic pop than typical chart music. This technical ambition, combined with the emotional undertow inherited from his folk music upbringing, is a large part of why ABBA's catalog still sounds rich and specific decades later, rather than dated. Benny sang lead vocal only once across ABBA's entire catalog on Susie Hangaround from the Waterloo album, a small but telling detail. He was never positioned or interested in being positioned as the group's frontman. His instrument was the architecture behind the voices, not the voice itself. If there is a real answer to the question of what made Benny Andersson's songwriting so effective, it isn't found in dramatic studio confessions. It's found in the mundane, disciplined routine he and Bjorn Ulvaeus built for themselves. According to ABBA's own official retrospectives and biographer Carl Magnus Palm's extensively researched books on the band, their process was almost the opposite of the myth of spontaneous inspiration. Bjorn has said plainly that there was nothing bohemian about it, that songwriting was a job requiring discipline, Not a matter of waiting for a spark of genius to strike in the middle of the night. Both men quickly concluded that if they waited for inspiration to arrive on its own, they would never finish anything. Instead, the two of them worked office hours, Monday through Friday, typically starting a new writing period in the weeks following an album's release. After a deliberate break of 2 or 3 months, Benny would sit at a piano or whichever keyboard was available, with Bjorn beside him holding an acoustic or electric guitar. They would throw musical fragments back and forth at each other, discarding hundreds of melody lines that didn't hold up, searching for the handful of ideas that felt genuinely complete. Benny has described the collaboration as being so intertwined that pinpointing individual authorship on a given melody line became almost meaningless. If one of them proposed a change and both agreed it worked, then, in his words, both had been equally involved in writing it. Once they had a piece of music they were satisfied with, it would go to the studio still without real lyrics, just nonsense syllables and placeholder English phrases, some of which became the working titles used internally while the song was finished. A single melody might be tried out as a waltz, a tango, a disco number, and a rock song before the right arrangement revealed itself. Benny has explained that part of the value of working with skilled session musicians was giving them room to shape a song in the studio, rather than dictating every note in advance, trusting good players to discover things a page of sheet music couldn't predict. Once a backing track was locked in, it would be mixed down to a rough cassette that Bjorn took home, listening to it repeatedly until he understood what emotional territory the song lived in, only then writing the actual lyrics to match. Agnetha and Frida were not simply hired voices layered on top of a finished product. Both women were active participants once they arrived in the studio, contributing their own ideas for phrasing, harmony, and delivery. Benny himself has pointed to their voices as the single most important ingredient separating ABBA's sound from anyone else's, the actual signature of the group, more than any chord progression he wrote. Behind all of this was engineer Michael B. Tretto, frequently described as ABBA's unofficial fifth member. Working alongside Benny and Bjorn, Tretto pioneered a dense, layered wall of sound production style, recording elements separately, deliberately avoiding cymbal-heavy drum mixes in favor of tom and bass drum forward arrangements, and using ambient microphones scattered through the recording rooms to capture natural room tone that gave ABBA's tracks their distinctive, orchestral fullness. By the mid-1970s, this way of working had outgrown the constraints of renting studio time by the day, so the group invested in converting a former Stockholm cinema into their own dedicated space, Polar Studios, which would go on to host the recording of their final 3 albums, Voulez-vous, Super Trooper, and The Visitors. Accounting for roughly half of ABBA's entire studio catalog, Polar was eventually sold off after a dispute over rental costs and no longer exists in its original form, though it has been recreated as an exhibit inside the ABBA Museum in Stockholm. This is one of the genuinely striking things about ABBA's story. Unlike bands that split acrimoniously and stop working together, Benny, Bjorn, Agnetha, and Frida continued to write, record, and release music together for roughly 2 more years after both marriages had ended. Whatever tension existed between them personally, the professional partnership, and specifically the writing partnership between Benny and Bjorn held. ABBA's dissolution in the early 1980s wasn't marked by a dramatic public breakup or a widely reported falling out. There was no single announced end in the way bands sometimes stage a farewell tour or a headline-grabbing statement. Instead, the group's activity simply slowed and then stopped. After 1982, Andersson and Ulvaeus moved into new creative territory, applying the same songwriting partnership that had built ABBA to an entirely different medium, musical theater. Their first major project after ABBA was Chess, written together with lyricist Tim Rice. The concept album, released in 1984 with vocals from Elaine Page, Barbara Dixon, Murray Head, and Swedish artists Tommy Kerberg and Bjorn Skifs, sold 2 million copies worldwide. The single One Night in Bangkok, performed by Murray Head, became a top 3 hit in the United States, while I Know Him So Well, the Page-Dixon duet, topped the UK charts. Chess went on to a West End run at London's Prince Edward Theatre, starting in 1986, though a later Broadway staging in 1988 was less successful, closing after only 2 months. This period reveals something important about Benny that often gets lost in the retrospective mythology of ABBA. He never stopped working. The persistent public image of ABBA's breakup as some kind of dramatic personal collapse doesn't match what he actually did next, which was immediately dive into one of the most ambitious and difficult projects of his career, a full-scale musical, co-written with a new lyricist, tackling entirely new subject matter. Away from the stage, Benny's personal life also moved forward. He married Swedish television presenter Mona Erklit in 1981, and the couple had a son, Ludwig. That relationship, unlike his earlier marriage to Frida, has lasted for decades, and Ludwig Andersson grew up to become deeply involved in his father's musical legacy, serving as one of the producers behind the ABBA Voyage concert residency, as well as the 2025 Broadway revival of Chess. Father and son are also co-owners of Riksmusikverket, known as RMV Studios, a recording studio located in a converted 150-year-old naval warehouse on the Stockholm island of Skepsholmen, which opened its doors in 2011. One part of Benny's story that he has discussed publicly without the need for any invented confession is his long struggle with alcohol. He has spoken candidly about having been an alcoholic through much of his adult life and about the discipline it took to leave that behind. He has remained sober since 2001. This is a real, well-documented thread in his biography, discussed in mainstream press coverage over the years, and it stands as one of the more genuinely honest, human elements of his public story, no dramatization required. Alongside his sobriety, 2001 also marked the start of a new musical chapter. Benny formed his own group, Benny Andersson's Orchestra, a dance band rooted in the same Swedish folk tradition that had shaped him as a child. It was, in a sense, a return to where he'd started, not chasing pop stardom, but simply making music tied to his roots, on his own terms, largely away from the international spotlight ABBA had once demanded of him. Benny and Björn's songwriting partnership continued to produce major work long after ABBA ended. Together they composed Kristina Friend du Vlemla, a Swedish-language musical that became one of the most significant works of musical theater in Sweden's history, exploring themes of emigration and hardship far removed from ABBA's pop concerns. Their most commercially visible post-ABBA success, however, came through a project built entirely on the group's original catalog, Mamma Mia, the stage musical built around ABBA's songs, and its subsequent 2008 film adaptation, for which Benny served as an executive producer, along with its 2018 sequel. The film version of Mamma Mia became the best-selling movie musical of all time, and the best-selling DVD in UK history, proof that decades after ABBA's active years, the songs Benny had helped craft still carried enormous commercial and emotional power for audiences who, in many cases, hadn't even been born during the band's original run. In 2010, Benny and Frida reunited on stage in New York to accept ABBA's induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, one of the rare occasions the former couple appeared publicly together in a professional capacity after their divorce decades earlier. During his acceptance speech, Benny offered one of his most genuine and quotable reflections on where ABBA's sound actually came from. He explained that in a country like Sweden with months of snow and long stretches without sunlight, that darkness inevitably shapes an artist's work. He pointed to the same melancholic thread running through Swedish and Russian folk music, through composers like Jean Sibelius and Edvard Grieg, through actress Greta Garbo and singer Jussi Björling, and, he said, through Frida and Agnetha's voices on some of ABBA's own songs. It was a rare moment of Benny explicitly naming, in his own words, the emotional undercurrent listeners had always sensed in ABBA's music, without necessarily being able to name it themselves. 2 years later, in 2012, he received an honorary doctorate of philosophy from Lund University of Technology's Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, formal academic recognition of a career that had, by then, spanned more than 4 decades. For nearly 40 years, Benny, Björn, Agnetha and Frida